In 1793, Lord McCartney received an audience with the Qianlong Emperor, the Manchu ruler of China who had sat on the throne for nearly 60 years. As we'll see in class, the meeting went poorly. The emperor gave McCartney a letter to George III that insisted in no uncertain terms that China had everything it needed to possess and was completely uninterested in foreign commerce. In light of subsequent events, the letter was seen as the height of ignorance, especially, of course, by the British. It demonstrated that China was so insular that it failed to recognize the self-evident power of the British Empire. By 1793, the British Empire was one upon which the sun almost never set. It had lost its 13 American colonies, but still possessed Canada, much of the Caribbean, and huge swaths of India. 5 years earlier, in 1788, the first British settlers arrived in Botany Bay in Australia. They were convicts. Australia at first was envisioned as a penal colony, but the British flag flew there all the same. Britain's most important possession was India, which was already considered the crown jewel of the British Empire. The British East India Company had established factories all along the Indian coast, most notably Bombay and Calcutta, but as the Mughal Empire declined during the 18th century, enterprising Britons in India and elsewhere sought to expand their commercial power. When the Mughal governor of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, sought with French help to remove the East India Company from the subcontinent, seizing Calcutta and imprisoning its European population in the notorious Black Hole, Robert Clive, the East India Company supervisor on the ground, made a deal with Dawla's subordinate, Mir Jafar. If Jafar would turn on Dawla, then Clive would make him governor in his stead and provide a substantial bribe to sweeten the deal. The ruse worked, but when Jafar proved less pliable as governor than Clive had hoped, Clive simply bribed someone else to take his place. And in 1765, Clive made the most beneficial deal of all. He negotiated an agreement with the Mughal emperor that granted the East India Company what it called the Diwani, or the right to collect taxes in Bengal. As the Mughal Empire declined, provincial governors were no longer bothering to send regular tax payments, and so the emperor, Shah Alam, granted the East India Company the province in exchange for those tax payments. Overnight, the company became the effective ruler of more than 20 million people, and it would be Indian revenue, along with Indian troops who joined Britain's overseas army, who would underpin Britain's empire. Despite also being a territorial power, the East India Company was first and foremost a corporation. It held for a time a monopoly on tea sold in the British Empire, tea that it purchased in either India or China. In exchange, the East India Company traded textiles and other manufactured goods. The Industrial Revolution in Britain, and in particular the harnessing of steam power, enabled the British to mass-produce goods that it could sell abroad. Indian consumers purchased British textiles and became in effect a captive market. Mass-produced goods in Britain could sell for much more cheaply than locally produced ones in India. British merchants raked in money from this venture, as they would continue to do for another 2 centuries, but many looked at neighboring China and saw an even larger market for British goods. After all, British merchants purchased large quantities of Chinese tea. But Chinese officials were wary of engaging in trade with Britain and imposed significant restrictions. British merchants were only allowed to reside in Canton in the south, and they were forbidden to bring women or families with them. They were also only allowed to exchange silver for tea. Chinese officials insisted that their country had no need for British manufactured goods, and that by selling tea or something else for silver, they were merely doing Britain a favor. As we'll discuss in class, the British would succeed, as they put it, in opening China. And by the 1840s, the power imbalance would be obvious even to the most nationalist official in Beijing. But in 1793, the year of McCartney's mission, it was not so obvious. More than 200 million people lived in China, a population much larger than all of Europe put together. Its cities were among the world's largest, and its gross domestic product was as large, if not larger, than anywhere in Europe. China was then ruled by the Manchu dynasty. The Manchus had invaded from Manchuria in the north and overthrown the Ming dynasty in 1644. The Manchus continued to discourage seaborne exploration and trade. The same insularity that prevented a repeat of Zheng He's mission was very much present in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it was under the Manchu, known in China as the Qing dynasty, that China's borders expanded to roughly where they are today. The Chinese government secured control of Tibet, where the Dalai Lama was permitted to remain as a figurehead, as well as the predominantly Muslim territory known today as Xizang province. The Quanlong Emperor himself waged a war of extermination against the Mongol Khanate that ruled the region, massacring whole cities in the process. By 1755, the region was formally incorporated into China, where it remains today, and where the Chinese government has recently launched what effectively amounts to cultural genocide against the Muslim Uyghurs who once ruled the region. But while the Chinese military was sufficiently powerful to overawe any local rivals, by 1793 it had fallen behind most powers in Europe, and not only in naval technology. In 1800, Chinese troops carried 17th century matchlock muskets, if they even carried guns at all, and their cannon were also 2 centuries out of date. But because the Chinese had not waged war against any other power that possessed these technologies, Chinese officials had no idea of how far behind they had fallen. In the 19th century, as we'll see in class, they would learn this the hard way.